Ottawa has earmarked $252 million over the next 5 years to protect ecologically sensitive land, water, and wildlife, all part of the federal government's first National Conservation Plan. Along with connecting Canadians with nature, the proposal targets conservation and restoring ecosystems on private land. By not including public land, critics say the focus is too narrow and will do little to conserve wilderness. Where will the federal dollars be spent? What does the plan potentially miss? And how much of an impact will it have on our province? And joining us this evening, Larry Simpson, Associate Vice President and Director of Strategic Philanthropy and Conservation for the Nature Conservancy of Canada. And in Ottawa, Stephen Hazell, Interim Executive Director of Nature Canada. Good evening, gentlemen. Good to see you both.
Good evening.
Good evening.
All right. Now, of the $250 million earmarked for this initiative, $50 million is to restore wetlands, another $50 to conserve species and habitat, and the big one, $100 million, set aside for your organization, Larry, the Nature Conservancy of Canada. Based on the work your group does, how do you expect that money could be used?
Well, we've got natural areas identified across southern Canada that have high conservation value. And we've been delivering in those areas since 2007 with a significant investment by the Government of Canada at that time. We've doubled the money since then and conserved close to 4,000 square kilometers of land, or almost over three quarters of a million acres of land. We expect to carry on with that and deliver in those important natural areas throughout the country, working with Canadians, landowners, or owners of rights to land in some cases, to help our country conserve a conservation legacy that our kids will be proud of.
Stephen, what do you make of the breakdown of dollars and where they are proposed to be spent?
Well, I think I want to start off by saying that this is a solid proposal from the government. These are good announcements, and we're delighted that the government has put this amount of money into this National Conservation Plan. We don't think it's really quite a plan yet. I mean, they've made some important announcements, and they've specified how some of the money is going to be spent, such as the $100 million for Nature Conservancy to do its private land conservation work. But we think that there's a number of areas that have really not been fleshed out quite yet, and we're looking forward to working with the government in terms of really trying to figure out exactly what they're going to do with these funds.
Stephen, much has been made in the national media that the focus is too narrow, maybe not enough emphasis on Crown or park land. Your assessment?
Well, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, I think from Nature Canada's perspective, we probably wish that there would have been more emphasis on public lands conservation. But listen, you've got to go with what the government gives you, and private land conservation is very important. The other thing that's important in this announcement, which I think is new, I think it's new for any government, is the idea that we really have to start focusing on connecting Canadians to nature. I mean, many Canadians have frankly become disconnected from nature. Our kids spend too much time watching videos. They're not outside, trying to understand nature, or just outside enjoying nature. This is something we've got to focus on, and we think it's right that the government has chosen this theme of connecting Canadians to nature as one of the themes of the National Conservation Plan.
An important point. I do want to come back to that in a moment. Larry, as a non-profit, your focus is on securing and stewarding private land in Alberta. Maybe explain for viewers, why not Crown land?
Well, we're trying to invest in lands that have high conservation value but higher levels of risk. It's not to say that there isn't very important conservation opportunities on Crown land. However, the even higher risk, of course, is on private land, where lands can be cultivated, native grange cultivated, or wetlands drained, or important lands along the eastern slopes subdivided and cultivated. We're focusing on areas on the private land base of highest risk, but it's not just private land. there are times when we will invest in acquiring rights to land, which may be mineral interests that facilitate the creation of large protected areas on Crown land too. So there are examples of that as well.
Okay. Now, Stephen, as you've pointed out, not a whole lot of detail in the initial announcement. More specific initiatives apparently will be forthcoming. But what do you hope for here in Alberta? What do you want to see?
Well, I think there are some really interesting opportunities in Alberta, and I want to focus on the grasslands in the southeast. Because in southeastern Alberta, there's all sorts of species at risk down there, a lot of them on private land and a lot of them on public land. I think one way in which some of these monies can be spent, such as the $50 million on voluntary initiatives, is for the government to try and work with the ranching community down in the southeast to help them protect species at risk on their lands. Because the truth is that ranchers and other rural landowners bear a lot of the burden in terms of protecting species at risk and the native grasslands down there. They need some help. I mean, there has been this emergency order for greater sage grouse, which the Nature Canada supported, but which we recognize is a challenge for some ranchers. So we have to come in and find ways to help them. And I think this National Conservation Plan could help in terms of providing the funding and the support and helping them design the management protocols that they need to actually protect species at risk on their lands and at the same time graze their cattle in an economically sustainable way.
Larry, do you see that being addressed?
Well, I see it as an opportunity, and I agree with much of what Stephen has said. Most of the land in southeast Alberta is Crown land, and I think a mix of regulatory and incentives in place, working with the people who live there and ranch it, I think is absolutely the way to go. And in that sense, I think there is an opportunity there on Crown land. So there is some private land, and we're working to address opportunities there too. So,
and now, Larry, for your efforts to be successful, how important is the protection of adjacent Crown lands? And I'm looking more specifically at headwaters and where watersheds are concerned.
Well, the Eastern Slopes is certainly one of the priorities for us. It's about 0.5% of the Northern Great Plains are still intact along the edge of the Rockies. And the economic model that once kept them intact, the ranch land basis, beginning to fragment and has been since about 1995. Just ranch economics cannot keep up, and so the land base is fragmenting. And I emphasize this is the last 0.5% of the Northern Great Plains. It still has places where there's a bear, a wolf, a cougar. The space that ranchers need there is the very space these other wildlife need too. So, there is urgency, and we're doing all we can to invest in conserving important and vulnerable private lands along the edge of the Rockies and these important watersheds.
Stephen, I want to come back to the point you made earlier about the focuses. One of the focuses of the plan is to connect with Canadians, connect Canadians with nature. So I want to ask you, how tangible a goal is that?
Well, I think it's early days yet, because I think the problem is really just being recognized in the past number of years. This so-called nature deficit disorder, for example, growing obesity rates in our kids, etc. I think we're just starting to get a handle on it now, but I think it's a very good sign that the Prime Minister actually spoke to this himself at the time that the plan was announced. So I'm taking this as a very positive sign. And I would say that a number of the not-for-profit nature groups across the country, including Nature Canada, but many others, we have got programs already that's trying to do that. In Nature Canada, we've got the Young Naturalist program, which tries to get kids outside and getting them to understand and appreciate nature. But it's going to take a fair amount of effort, and I think it's going to be some years before we really reap the dividends. It's tough competing against Grand Theft Auto.
Larry, from your perspective, how key is this goal to the overall success of the National Conservation Plan?
I think it's in the long run, I think it's vital. We, as an organization, reach out to a lot of different people. Sometimes they're running companies, sometimes they're farmers or ranchers. But if they haven't somehow connected with the outdoors and nature by the time they're 14 or 15 years old, then when we're talking to them as 30, 40, 50 years old, there isn't that connection to nature, that visceral, even affection for it that makes them care. And I was listening to a talk by Bryden Keene not long ago, and he said that 25 years ago, 80% of the kids spent a lot of time outdoors playing, and today it's like 20% are spending a lot of time outdoors playing, just getting in nature. So I think it's a real problem and a real opportunity for this program.
Stephen, what more are you looking for out of this plan?
Well, I think we actually had some meetings with government officials today, and I think they recognize that this is a living plan, that it will evolve over time. So we're hoping to build on the foundations that have been built in the past month. For example, the amount of money that's committed to connecting Canadians to nature, it's really, I think it's $9 million. So it's really not a lot of money. We're hoping that we can show some success with this, and that the government will be able to perhaps make some larger investments. I think as well that while public land conservation was not featured in this plan, we're hoping, and we will certainly be urging the government to make that a priority in the future, whether we're talking about national parks, or whether we're talking about national wildlife areas. There's a number of ways in which the government can protect public lands, and we're hoping that will be the case in the years to come. But certainly, I mean, this is a solid beginning, and we want to congratulate the government for its efforts on this.
And Larry, last word to you. Being the only land trust organization essentially named in the funding, how much pressure does this put on the shoulders of the Nature Conservancy of Canada?
Well, I think virtually everyone who works for the Nature Conservancy, our volunteer boards and supporters, we have a very high level of expectation as to what we want to accomplish. And every single day we arrive, we're trying to figure out, well, how can we create the greatest possible value for the public and for conservation with every penny that's either given to us or that happens to be, we're fortunate enough to be allocated in a grant from the Government of Canada, which we, I might point out, have to match. So it's really driven by Canadians themselves as they match money into that program.
Gentlemen, we'll have to leave it there. Very much appreciate your perspectives this evening. Thank you kindly.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you.
That's Larry Simpson. He's Associate Vice President, Director of Strategic Philanthropy and Conservation for the Nature Conservancy of Canada. And in Ottawa tonight, Stephen Hazell, Interim Executive Director of Nature Canada.